You wake up in a forest with no memory of which direction you came from. No phone, no map, no one calling your name. And somewhere in your chest, a very old alarm starts ringing. But the real answer to what actually happened next for a real ancient human in that exact situation is far stranger than panic. It was a survival problem with a surprisingly precise set of solutions. You assume getting lost from your tribe meant wandering aimlessly until you died. Mostly, it didn't work that way. Ancient humans did not simply vanish into the woods and hope for the best. Losing your group was common enough and dangerous enough that entire systems existed just to prevent it and to reverse it when it happened anyway. Understanding those systems tells you something surprising about how fragile and how resourceful your ancestors really were. How did people actually get separated in the first place? Rarely by accident alone. Usually by one of a handful of repeating situations, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years. The most common was the hunt gone wrong. Hunting parties chased migrating herds across open, unfamiliar terrain, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Anthropological reconstructions of Paleolithic hunting behavior suggest that persistence hunting, tracking an animal for extreme distances until it collapsed from exhaustion, was a real strategy used by early humans. A hunter locked onto a chase could cover ground far beyond any territory they knew by heart. Add dusk falling fast, add a sudden storm, add unfamiliar hills that all start to look the same, and a skilled, capable adult could lose track of the return path within a single afternoon. Consider how this actually unfolded. A group of 3 or 4 hunters spots a wounded animal, one that's been struck by a spear but hasn't gone down. Adrenaline takes over. The chase weaves through terrain no one is paying close attention to because every ounce of focus is locked onto the prey ahead. By the time the animal finally collapses, hours later, the sun has shifted, the wind has changed direction, and the familiar hills from that morning are nowhere in sight. One hunter, faster or more determined than the others, might pull ahead of the group entirely during the final stretch of the chase, arriving at the kill alone, with no clear memory of exactly which route brought him there. The second was conflict. Rival bands competing over water sources, hunting grounds, or simple territory sometimes clashed, and clashes scattered people. A raid on a camp did not just cause injury, it caused chaos. And chaos separated families in every direction at once. Survivors fled toward whatever cover was closest, not toward each other, and reuniting afterward was never guaranteed. In the panic of a raid, a parent might grab one child and run one way, while another relative grabbed a second child and ran the opposite way, each assuming, hoping that the other made it out too. Sorting that out afterward, if it happened at all, could take days. The third was migration itself. Groups moved with the seasons, following game and edible plants across enormous ranges. That movement did not wait for stragglers. An elder slowed by age, a hunter recovering from injury, a mother exhausted from childbirth. Any of them could fall behind a group that needed to keep moving or starve. The tribe's survival sometimes required leaving the slowest member temporarily behind, with an understanding, in many documented traditional societies, that the group would circle back once conditions allowed. This was rarely treated as abandonment in the modern emotional sense. It was closer to triage, a hard calculation about which choice kept the greatest number of people alive, made with the shared expectation that the separation was temporary rather than final. The fourth was deliberate exile, which worked differently from all the others, because it was a decision, not an accident. Groups that practiced banishment, according to ethnographic studies of surviving hunter-gatherer societies, almost always used it as a last resort after repeated smaller punishments. Mockery, exclusion from decisions, public shaming had already failed to correct someone's behavior. Exile removed a person entirely, and unlike accidental separation, exile came with no expectation of return. This distinction mattered enormously for what happened next. Someone accidentally separated from their group could reasonably expect a search, a fallback meeting point, a welcome home once found. Someone formally exiled had none of that. The trail markers meant to guide a lost hunter home offered no comfort to a person the group had actively decided to remove. If anything, returning uninvited after an exile could provoke violence rather than relief, since the group had already judged that person's continued presence a threat to everyone's survival. This made exile, rare as it was, the single most dangerous form of separation, precisely because every other safety net had been deliberately withdrawn along with it. And the fifth, the darkest one, was the disappearance of the tribe itself. Disease could tear through a small band in days. A hard winter could starve a group faster than anyone expected. A larger predator or a violent raid could wipe out most of the adults in a matter of minutes. Survivors of these events were not lost from their tribe. They had no tribe left to find. For a survivor of this fifth scenario, the entire framework of navigation, trail markers, and rendezvous points became meaningless because there was no group waiting at the other end of the trail. The only remaining option was the kinship network stretching outward into neighboring bands, and even that depended entirely on whether the survivor was mobile enough and knowledgeable enough to reach someone who could vouch for who they were. So separation was not rare. It was a reoccurring hazard built into the basic conditions of ancient life. Which means the real question is not how people got lost. It's how so many of them actually made it back. Here's where the story gets more impressive than most people expect. Hunter-gatherer navigation did not rely on luck. It relied on an extraordinarily detailed internal map built over years of walking the same territory on repeat. Researchers studying traditional foraging societies, including groups like the Juhoansi of the Kalahari and Aboriginal Australian communities with deep generational knowledge of their land, have documented navigational skill that borders on the astonishing by modern standards. Individuals could describe the exact layout of terrain across areas spanning many dozens of kilometers, recalling specific rock formations, water holes, and tree lines with precision built from a lifetime of repeated travel. This was not a talent reserved for a gifted few. It was baseline competence expected of most adults, because getting the geography wrong could cost your life. This kind of spatial memory started forming in early childhood. Children accompanied adults on foraging trips almost as soon as they could walk long distances, absorbing the landscape passively at first, then more deliberately as they grew older and began contributing to the group's food supply themselves. By adulthood, that landscape was not something a person had to consciously recall. It functioned more like a second language, spoken fluently, without translation, activated instantly whenever the terrain around them matched a pattern they had walked 100 times before. Layered on top of that internal map was environmental navigation, the position of the sun through the day, the direction of prevailing winds, the pattern of moss or lichen growth on the north or south side of trees, depending on latitude, star positions after dark, which shift predictably across the night and across the seasons. None of this required instruments. It required attention. And attention was something ancient humans had in abundance because their environment demanded it constantly, not occasionally. None of these methods worked in isolation from one another either. A skilled navigator cross-checked one signal against another, noting that the wind direction matched what it had been that morning, that the sun's angle confirmed roughly how much time had passed, that a particular star, tracked earlier in the night, still sat at an expected point in the sky. This layering of evidence, rather than reliance on any single cue, is what made ancient navigation resilient. A single cloudy day might obscure the sun, but wind patterns and terrain memory could still hold the line until clearer skies returned. There was also a more deliberate system at work, one specifically built for moments exactly like this: trail marking. Many traditional societies developed conventions for leaving signs behind precisely so that a separated member could follow them back to the group. A broken branch angled a certain way, a small pile of stones stacked at a junction, ash scattered from an extinguished fire marking where the group had camped the night before. These were not improvised in the moment of crisis. They were shared cultural knowledge, taught early, understood by everyone in the group, functioning almost like a language written into the landscape itself. These sign systems worked because they were redundant and layered. A single broken branch might be missed, blown away, or trampled by passing animals, so groups often left multiple overlapping markers along the same stretch of trail, each reinforcing the others. A cairn at a river crossing, a distinctive arrangement of bent grass at a fork in the path, charcoal smudged onto a rock face at a junction likely to confuse. None of these markers needed to be elaborate. They only needed to be consistent enough that anyone raised within the culture would recognize their meaning instantly, the way you instantly recognize a stop sign without needing to read the word printed on it.
And critically, many groups had an agreed fallback point. Not a random hope of reunion, but a specific known location, often a reliable waterhole, a distinctive rock formation, or the previous night's campsite, where anyone who became separated was expected to go and simply wait. This single practice solved an enormous coordination problem. Instead of two lost parties both wandering and searching for each other across a vast landscape, one party stayed still, while the other searched a much smaller, predictable set of locations. Because here's the part that matters just as much as the lost individual's own effort. The group did not simply move on and forget. Losing a member was expensive. A missing hunter meant less meat for the group's next meal. A missing gatherer meant fewer hands identifying which plants were safe to eat this season. A missing caregiver meant more strain on everyone else raising children or tending the sick. Groups had strong incentive to search, at least for a limited window, before any decision to move on permanently. Ethnographic accounts of search behavior in traditional societies describe organized efforts, small parties fanning out along known trails, checking familiar landmarks, calling out at agreed intervals, sometimes for days at a time, before abandoning the search.
These searches were not random wandering either. They followed a logic of their own. Searchers typically started at the last known location and worked outward in the direction the missing person was most likely to have traveled, based on where the hunt had been heading, or which water source was nearest, or which direction storm clouds had pushed anyone caught outdoors. Calling out at set intervals mattered enormously in dense terrain, since sound could travel through forest canopy or across valleys in ways that sight alone could not. A missing person who heard a familiar voice calling their name from a known direction had, in an instant, an entirely different set of odds than one navigating blind. What happened if the search failed and the person never found their own group again? This is where kinship networks became the second safety net. Traditional hunter-gatherer bands were rarely fully isolated from one another. Marriage, trade, and seasonal gatherings connected neighboring groups across a wider social web, and individuals typically carried extensive knowledge of relatives, in-laws, and trading partners living in other bands scattered across the region. A person who stumbled into unfamiliar territory and encountered strangers was not automatically treated as a threat. If they could establish who their kin were, who they were related to by blood or marriage, they often had a legitimate claim to hospitality and protection, even among people they had never personally met. This system, documented across many surviving hunter-gatherer cultures, meant that being lost from your immediate tribe did not necessarily mean being lost from all of humanity.
This web of distant kinship functioned almost like an insurance policy stretched across an entire region. Ethnographers studying groups such as the Juhawansi have described elaborate naming and gift exchange systems that linked individuals to namesakes and trading partners in bands they might rarely, if ever, physically visit. A traveler arriving hungry and disoriented at an unfamiliar camp could invoke these connections, almost like a passport, establishing within minutes of conversation who they were tied to and why they deserved to be fed and sheltered rather than turned away. Reintegration, when it worked, followed a predictable emotional and social pattern too. A returning or newly arrived individual would typically be questioned carefully, establishing identity and lineage before being folded into the group's daily rhythms, given a task, a role, a place at the fire. Belonging, once re-established, tended to happen quickly
because the group needed working hands just as much as the individual needed protection. It was a mutual transaction disguised as compassion. But when none of these systems worked, when there was no trail to follow, no fallback point remembered, no search party sent, no neighboring kin to find, the outcome shifted from a survival story into something closer to a slow unraveling.
This is where the earlier discussion of psychological collapse actually earns its place, not as the whole story, but as the final stage of it. A person who exhausted every practical option, who could not retrace their steps, who reached no waterhole, no rendezvous point, no distant relative's camp, entered a different kind of crisis entirely. The body, deprived of the shared vigilance and labor of a group, began failing faster than starvation alone would predict. The mind, deprived of any confirming voice, any shared version of reality, began fraying at the edges. Isolation research on extreme environments describes this same pattern echoing forward through history, in solitary confinement studies and polar expedition accounts, where prolonged separation from any other human voice produces disorientation and psychological strain remarkably quickly, sometimes within days rather than weeks. Sleep became the first casualty in these worst-case scenarios. Without a group to share the burden of staying alert through the night, a person alone had to choose between exhausting vigilance and dangerous rest, and neither option led anywhere good. Within a few days, chronic sleep deprivation on top of physical strain began degrading judgment itself, the very faculty most needed to solve the navigation problem in the first place. This created a vicious cycle. The longer someone stayed lost, the worse their decision-making became, and the worse their decision-making became, the longer they were likely to stay lost.
Which means the true ending to this story was almost never a single dramatic moment. It was a layered failure. Practical navigation failing first, social systems failing second, and only then, as a last stage, the mind and body failing together. Most of the time, though, that final stage never arrived. Most separated individuals had a map in their memory, signs on the trail, a known place to wait, and a group willing to come looking. The systems worked more often than they failed, precisely because failure was so catastrophic that every culture built redundancy against it, generation after generation, until searching for a lost person and waiting to be found became instinctive behavior, passed down like any other survival skill. That redundancy is worth appreciating on its own terms. It represents something close to an unspoken agreement embedded in the culture itself, a shared understanding that no single failure, one wrong turn, one bad storm, one chaotic raid, should be enough to end a person's life if it could possibly be prevented. Every marked trail, every known waterhole, every distant cousin willing to take in a stranger was a small piece of insurance built collectively over generations, so that the individual mistake of getting lost did not have to become a death sentence. You still carry a faint echo of that instinct today. The urge to retrace your steps when you're lost in an unfamiliar city. The relief of finding a landmark you recognize. The specific comfort of a meeting point agreed in advance when a group splits up in a crowd. None of it feels ancient. All of it is. You wake up in a forest with no memory of which direction you came from, and now you know exactly what your ancestors would have done next.